Hi, everyone, and welcome to this fireside chat. My name is Dr. Eric Kowalczyk. I'm the founder and CEO of Connection Point, and I am thrilled to be doing this joint podcast between Connection Point and 21CP. Deb's going to introduce herself to you all in a second. Just to say that we're really appreciative of the fact that you're taking time to join us in this conversation. It's going to be about a really important topic in a time in our country where public trust is fracturing in government institutions and government relations, and maintaining that public trust is so important. And that the way that we see really strong community relations being maintained is both in the policies and procedures that municipalities have, but also in how they talk about them. And so today I'm joined and joining Deb, who's going to introduce herself, and 21CP.
Thanks, Derek. So I'm Deborah Spence. I'm the Director of Business Development for 21CP Solutions. And we are a consulting firm that seeks to empower organizations to meet the complex challenges of delivering safe, effective, and just public safety services. We work with local law enforcement agencies and local governments across the country to help improve public safety service and really make it a co-production of safety between both the agencies and the communities they serve. But I will say one of the things I am really excited for in this conversation, Eric, is that before joining 21CP, I spent the bulk of my career with the COPS office. And while I was there, I helped design the Preparing for Active Shooter Situations grant program. I oversaw all of the COPS funded training that was provided by Alert, and even had the opportunity to serve on the National Fire Protection Association's technical committee for NFPA 3000, which is the national standard on multidisciplinary response to active shooter and hostile events. And communications planning is part of that standard. And I think that's really the space that 21CP and Connection Point intersect at.
Yeah, I think that's what makes this conversation a really interesting one for people to be able to listen to, right? Because at Connection Point, we obviously work with municipalities across the country, and typically when we're working with them, it's when they're in the midst of the crisis, right? And so we're trying to find ways to remind the public of reasons why they trusted their government to begin with, and then where there's a mistake or where there's a misunderstanding of what's taking place, we work to shore up that public trust. And the pre-planning work that you did with the Department of Justice COPS office is vital, right? In having something to lean on, in having a resource or a common set of understanding to go back to. Because what we're seeing right now, in real time almost on a daily basis now, is that every major incident that takes place, whether it's in a small community or a large city, it follows the same pattern. While the individual specifics might be different, the pattern of how the public responds, how the media responds is the same. And what you see time and again is that the public is asking, how did this happen? And from our perspective, the most damaging answer that any government can give is just silence. In 2026, silence isn't understandable. It's a failure, and that failure can have really long-term ramifications for public trust, but also just for public safety in general, and how those relationships are maintained between law enforcement organizations and their community. And so um, part of the work that you did was in that pre-planning. Can you talk a little bit about the the various ways that you saw that pre-planning unfold, some of the things that you were involved in, and how you see that threat landscape changing over time?
Sure. I will say one of the things that I think has been really interesting as time has moved along is how the public reacts when news breaks of something happening, a critical incident, right? That now instantaneously everybody pulls their phone out, they're on social media. That's where they're asking questions. That's where they're looking for answers. And I don't know for me, for you, but definitely for me, the internet loves a vacuum. It'll fill whatever space is there. Um, but when I think about the threat landscape more generally, I think that most people within law enforcement are still operating on a slightly outdated picture, and not just about the phones.
For sure.
But what we're seeing at 21CP is a fundamental shift in how threats materialize. We're moving away from coordinated hierarchical attack models that really dominated all of the strategic thinking and planning that went in post 9/11. What communities are facing now is much more diffuse. I think growing interest in lone wolf attacks is really the clearest example of that. A single individual, probably radicalized online, has minimal operational footprint in the community. They don't give the signals that law enforcement is really used to looking for. There's no cell structure to infiltrate. There's no communications to intercept. By the time an agency really gets a read on the threat, the window to act is often already closing.
Sure.
Um, but it's not just the lone actors. The broader threat landscape is just decentralized. Groups, ideologies, grievances, they spread laterally, and it's across platforms, across borders. A threat that emerges in one city can inspire a similar action someplace else within hours, not months or years. So to me, the threat isn't just evolving, it's decentralizing faster than systems can adapt.
What's interesting about that point is we're recording this in April of 2026, and not 2 weeks ago, there was an attack on a religious institution that was inspired by a lone wolf actor who was exactly what you were describing, right? Through the internet, was radicalized, and then saw an event take place in one city and replicated that event in another. So everything that you're talking about right now, it's not just theory, it's what's actually happening.
I think the speed of escalation is something that we just don't talk enough about, too. An incident can go from zero to critical in 2 to 3 minutes. And most jurisdictions have response protocols that assume a 5 to 7 minute timeline. But that gap is where the most people get hurt. We've seen in many active shooter situations over the years that the majority of the victims are injured or killed before law enforcement can even arrive on the scene. And then I think there's also a real training question to look into. We have departments that they do their active shooter drills, they run their tabletops, they check those boxes. But how much did that training reflect reality? The chaos, the incomplete information, the decisions that have to be made before you really understand what you're dealing with. That gap between training and real world performance, I think, is where the failures really live.
There's an expectation, right, that the community has. You and I have both done work in communities talking with uh, um, faith leaders, civic leaders, sort of these advocates of broader swaths of the community. And the thing that always comes up is that irrespective of the threat, irrespective of the nature of whatever takes place, how it unfolds, there's an expectation that government has it, that they should have been prepared, they should have been trained for it, they should have known that this was going to happen. You get those questions in briefings all the time, and I can think of 5 different large-scale events where within minutes the questions that are being asked are, what did you know? When did you know it? Why weren't you able to stop this? Why weren't you able to prevent this from happening? And that training delta that you were talking about, you you look at a possibility probability matrix, and you can't possibly train for everything, so you train for the most likely scenarios. And when an incident unfolds that isn't cleanly and neatly in one of those training categories, it's not just an operational failure, right? Because the skills, the training, or whatever was necessary wasn't there. But it's also a narrative and an expectation failure as well. Because as we see the incident unfold, and law enforcement is reacting to the real-time situation on the ground. And this is, by the way, not to take away from any of the people that are doing the work of responding, right? You're going into an unknown situation, and that's challenging and difficult, and you're finding solutions in real time. The failure, though, comes in how the municipality itself communicates what's happening to its community, how it shapes and frames the narrative. And you started this off by talking about, everybody pulls out their phone. And if there's silence, if there's a vacuum of information in there, people are going to fill it in. Social media fills it in. Uh, I'm not gonna talk about too many recent incidents, but there was an incident this past weekend in which a notable political figure went quiet for a couple of hours, and social media was rife with speculation about what had happened and what was going on, and conspiracy theories were bubbling over. And that same thing at a national level absolutely happens at the local level. And what we tell people is, you've got 10 minutes. From the first moment that crisis unfolds, whatever it is, whether it's a lone wolf attack, a school shooting, some sort of an explosion or a weather event, you've got 10 minutes to start actively messaging to your community. And if you don't, someone else is going to take hold of that narrative, and they're going to define what the trust trajectory actually looks like for not just that immediate moment, but that aftermath. Uh, and it's something that we've seen time and time again. The reality is, most governments don't fail during the crisis, they fail in the first 10 minutes. And it's all in how they establish that narrative.
You made a really interesting point in there too, that I just want to reinforce, and that's that, what I have seen over the last 2 decades is that failure doesn't come from capability, right? First responders are really well trained, and that has continued to improve over the years. It really does come down to coordination and communication. So I think that's a really important point. Um, one Something else that I feel really strongly about is that operational planning doesn't equal public readiness, right?
Mhm.
We have jurisdictions that have invested real resources into preparedness. They've built policies, they've done the training, they conduct assessments, they run after action reviews after significant incidents. That work really matters. We have to be prepared to learn from our failures as well as our successes. And, I'm also a huge proponent of studying the near misses as well. That nothing is an accident, everything is the result of a series of conditions and decisions. But a well-run after-action review in and of itself doesn't necessarily translate into public confidence. You could have the best incident command structure in the country, and if the communication coming out of your incident is fragmented or delayed, the public isn't going to know it. What they're going to remember is the confusion.
Yeah, you were in a position for a pretty significant portion of your career where you were able to see the effort and energy and intensity that went into shaping policies, into shaping training, into defining those expectations. And I'm I'm curious about. There's another point that you made that I want to pick up on, but I'm curious from your perspective. You know, I think I started my law enforcement career in 2002, and I was being trained by people who came on the job in the 1980s, who were being trained by people who came on the job in the 1960s, right? So there's this 40-year sort of institutional memory that goes into the training that I receive in the first year of my career. And then I look at how training has evolved and how expectations have evolved over the last quarter century. And I have to think that the public safety professionals are better trained, better equipped, better prepared than I think they've ever been in history. And I'm just curious about your view of that.
I think that's very true. And sort of how long have I been doing this? About 25 years. I think, yes, I've seen a generational turnover in policing, and the departments that I visited and talked to and the officers that I've gotten to know. Uh, I Early in my career, there were conversations about, is policing a job or is it a profession? And I think that's been answered. The skill set, the experience, the expectations that are placed on police officers, the broadening of uh, issues that they deal with in communities, and the expectations that communities put on them has really raised the level of what is the baseline of policing in this country. And not to take away from any of the 20th century predecessors of today's officers, but I think it is a very different job. It's a lot more complex. It's a lot more in the public eye, and the threats and challenges that they face are bigger, with more serious implications than ever before.
Yeah, and this isn't to say that there still isn't opportunity for additional training or reform or tightening of relationships with communities and better understanding of communities' needs and expectations. We know that that's still a part of this evolutionary process. But as we're looking specifically at like these response to lone wolf attacks or a mass coordinated attack, whatever it is, the standards and the way in which law enforcement is trained is light years ahead of where it was a decade ago, certainly 20 years ago. For me, the biggest um, the real gap here is exactly what you said at the beginning of this part of the conversation, which is that the operational planning, the training, the intensity of what officers and organizations are thinking about and planning for doesn't mean the public is ready for the same event. And it certainly doesn't mean that they know that that training is taking place, that the thought and the detailed planning has gone into some of these things. And uh, that's kind of a holdover of an old mindset that's still there, right? About not talking about what's taking place. And it's disconnected, I think, from where we are actually are as a society. And while I certainly don't think that we have adapted to the speed of social media in the norms of our communication yet. I think that I talk about this a lot when I'm doing training. We, for thousands of years, had a method that we communicated with, and it was slow and it was considered and it was deliberate, and it was often involving, papyrus and clay tablets, right? And maybe a song by the campfire. And then in the last 100 or so years, we get the advent of electronic technology and telephones and TV, and that starts to speed things up pretty significantly. And then we get into social media where it's at the tip of your fingers is access to global news. We haven't established those societal norms around what that means. The challenge that that represents for both police departments, public safety, first responders, and for government leaders is that the operating paradigm of confirm everything, cross all the T's, dot all the I's before you ever say anything doesn't match the lived reality of people being able to access global information at the touch of their fingers. And that gap is not just a nice to have, it's a necessity that public safety organizations need to be thinking about because you lose your community trust in that silence. And what you're actually creating with the rise of AI and technology is this ability for misinformation to spread, mis and disinformation to spread at speeds that we've never had to encounter before. I mean, this is within the last couple of years that mis and disinformation in and of itself is a new active threat that we have to deal with.
Yeah, I think back to, even like I said, 7 or 8 years ago, and what we were talking about in terms of planning for mass casualty events, and the communications discussions focused around, family notification, reunification, um, formal press statements. And if agencies now are fully trained up on that, they're already behind the ball again in terms of how communication and news works. Like just that it's actually really hard to think back even to 2015 and uh smartphones were not ubiquitous at that point, right? There none of the AI tools that exist were available to the public. So it's a very different world in a very quick turnover. And there's a lot of law enforcement agencies to train and hundreds of thousands of law enforcement officers, not to mention other first responders in the country, and to continually update that training and make sure that all of their preparedness plans and strategies are up to date is a lot of work and hard to do.
As soon as you said 2015, of course, for me, 2015, I flash back to my time in Baltimore and what was happening. Um, and it's, wow, the cognitive dissonance, it's really easy to think about in some ways in my head that it was yesterday. But then I do think about our use of technology, and the way it's totally different in a 10-year period. Um, we haven't built the systems to respond to perception, even though everybody needs them,
Yeah. Just as a side note, in 2015, I had a BlackBerry.
right? Can you imagine like an analog keyboard? Nobody would even know how to use that anymore. Uh,
Exactly.
but that
The
wasn't that long ago.
No.
So I guess my question for you is, as you're thinking about, in this conversation, we've talked about what the threat landscape looks like and how it's constantly evolving. It's constantly uh, changing, and that the threat landscape doesn't just include, those physical acts, but now we've got to contend with mis and disinformation as an equally viable threat landscape. What does preparedness actually look like for you?
Um, so for me, I think of it in four phases. So I'll walk through the operations
Yeah.
of each one. First is anticipation, and this is the threat modeling, the work that happens before anything occurs. It's like looking at your community, at your infrastructure, your event calendar, your known vulnerabilities, and really asking yourself as an organization, where are we exposed? And not generically, but specifically, the analysis that needs to be done there should be driving resource allocations and your mutual aid agreements and your training priorities, right? Second is alignment. And this is where I think agencies fall short a lot. You can have a great policy on paper, but if your team isn't aligned on how to execute that under pressure, if there's ambiguity about who's in charge, who communicates what, who has authority to make the calls, that policy becomes meaningless the moment an incident starts. So leadership alignment really has to be built before the crisis and not sorted out during it.
Mhm.
Um, Activation. This is the operational response itself. And the standard here has to be there can be no surprises internally. Everyone on the team should know their role, their lane, their escalation path. This activation phase is not when you should be drafting procedures. And then the fourth is the aftermath. And I think this is where work either compounds or corrodes. The agencies that use after action reviews as genuine learning tools rather than as a compliance exercise, they're the ones that get better over time. So reform has to be real and it has to be visible to the people who serve under that leadership. And I think altogether, this is really about saying that preparedness is a system, it's not just a plan.
I like that a lot. Uh, I'm a comms pro, right? So I'm listening to you and I'm like, 4As, that should be a thing that 21CP brands, because that's really good. And as you were talking, I was kind of mapping how we approach, we use phrases like before, during, and after the crisis, or delivering targeted and ethical information to the right people at the right time so they can do the right thing, right? But if I was to map our approach onto what you were talking about in those 4As, I think the first one was anticipation that you said.
Mhm.
Um, for me, that's the crisis pre-plan. That's doing the hard work that nobody wants to do because it's long and it's hard and it's complicated, but sitting down and really doing that probability possibility matrix and mapping out what is the likely scenarios that you're going to face and doing those initial holding statements, thinking about your communication modalities, thinking about who's going to be the person delivering these messages. That's really in that same vein as and almost and well, it really should be done at the same time and in the same room as the people doing that threat modeling. I was taking diligent notes as you were talking, and so when it comes to alignment, um, you talked about, I think, both internal and external alignment with your stakeholders and neighboring partners, and I think here you said that nothing should be a surprise, which I really liked. And that same thing holds true for the community, right? Nothing should be a surprise. They should understand how you're going to communicate with them during an emergency, how they should be getting information, that you're building that relationship over time, that you're that trusted source of news and information so that when the whatever the crisis, and notice that I said when the crisis happens because it's not an if, it's a when the crisis happens, they know to turn to you. The everybody focuses, understandably, on the operational response and what boots on the ground are doing and what that looks like. But at the same time, there's an anxious and a concerned and a scared public, and we can't forget that. And the media is certainly going to amplify that. I've got video after video of reporters saying we haven't heard anything from insert public safety organization here, right? So that real-time communication is just as important. I think we've hammered that point home. It's 2026. It's not 1986. Real-time communication is as important in your public safety strategy as anything else. And for us in communications, and I'm going to go out on a little limb here and say for you in the work that 21CP does, certainly we respond after the fact, right? We will come in, we can do the reviews, we can do the clarity and the work to reform. But this is a holistic before, during, and after effort to maintain public trust. And that is accomplished um, in how you manage those first 10 minutes of the crisis. It's how you manage the first 10 minutes of getting information out to your community, but it's all the work that you did before. And if you're not ready, if you're not prepared, if you're not doing that work, um, then when the crisis happens, you don't have a foundation to respond from. So I love your 4 A's. I'm going to borrow them. They work really, really well.
Uh, this reminds me that I think policing is such a reactive profession, right? That's what it does. It responds to calls. But there is such value in taking the time to do this planning work and this preparedness work and the training. It's going to save you time and energy and money when that crisis really does hit. And I think you're right. I think many years ago there was a project. We published a book out of the cop's office called Preparing for the Unimaginable. And I think nowadays it's not that it's unimaginable, it all is imaginable. And you need to assume that something is going to happen in your community at some point and make sure you're ready for it.
I guess we've been talking for a little while here, and I appreciate everybody hanging in with us. I think that this conversation is super important. I might be biased because this is what I do, and I go into these communities where trust is broken. You all go into communities where trust has been broken, and so we see the aftermath of both operational failures and trust failures and what happens. I I like to think about the future and I like to think about hope and opportunity. And for somebody who's listening to this as we wind our way towards the end of this conversation, for somebody who's listening to this and they feel like maybe they're ready, they feel like maybe they've done some of the work, some of the planning, some of the training. Maybe they've got good relationships with their community. What is it that if you could have 5 seconds with them or 30 seconds with them that you'd want them to be thinking about or to be actually looking hard at and having an honest dialogue with themselves about?
I This is a really good question. I got to think about that one for a minute. I think, hmm, I think at the end of the day, preparedness is an act of accountability. It's the commitment that you as an agency leader are making to your community before they need you. So it's not about when the cameras are on, it's before. The agencies and jurisdictions that do this well, they've really made a decision that trust is something that they build in advance, that they build a little bit every day. They do it through training, they do it through transparency, they do it just in their daily interactions with their community, showing them that you take them seriously. And then when something does happen, they don't have to scramble for that credibility. They already have it. So ultimately, the question isn't whether something will happen, it's whether you've done the work so that your community believes that you're ready. And that can only be done day in, day out, thoughtfully and deliberately.
I know well enough to know when somebody's dropped a really, really strong truth bomb into the room. And that to me feels like a great place to end this conversation. So, thank you for sitting down with me and letting me sit down with you and having this conversation. I think um, there are so many rooms and spaces where conversations like this take place, but aren't necessarily happening out in the open and transparently. And so, for all of those people that don't have access to those rooms but are thinking about these things seriously and thinking about what the next 5 to 10 years looks like, I love that we were able to have this conversation and be able to share it with people. So, thank you for that.
Thank you. This was a great idea. We should do it again sometime.
I'm here for it.